Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to this 8th and final session of Stakeholder Forum's Countdown to the SDG Summit 2023, a series of 8 webinars in the run-up to the September 2023 SDG Summit and the 2024 Summit for the Future. With the support of experts in each of the first 16 SDGs, we have been reviewing 2 SDGs each month since November 2022, and conclude today with a discussion around SDGs 15 and 16. That is life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions. Less than 2 weeks before the start of the July 2023 United Nations High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. Today's webinar continues to explore where we are in SDG implementation and to identify transformative actions for change with an emphasis on strengthening the environmental dimension of the 2030 Agenda. It has been organized by Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future in connection with our proposed 2023 platform, an instrument to support greater and more effective stakeholder participation in the SDG Summit 2023 during this review cycle of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development during the 2023 United Nations High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. I'm Charles Newhan, Chairman of Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future, and your host today from New York. I'm joined today also from New York by our moderator, Dr. David O'Connor, permanent representative of the International Union for Conservation of Nature to the United Nations. As you can see on your screen, we have a panel of special guests who, from a diverse range of experiences and knowledge, will be introduced by David in the coming minutes. Now, for those of you not familiar with Stakeholder Forum, it is an international, not-for-profit NGO in consultative status with the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, commonly known as ECOSOC, since 1996. Also accredited with the United Nations Environment Program since 2005, and holds observer status with the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, Framework Convention on Climate Change. SF has, for more than 25 years, been working to advance sustainable development at all levels by providing a bridge between those who have a stake in sustainable development and the international forums where decisions are made in their name. Now, before I hand over the floor to our first speaker, here's a bit of housekeeping to attend to. Please note that the webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, and a link to that recording will be posted on the Stakeholder Forum website soon after. As you will see, attendee cameras and microphones are muted and will remain so throughout the webinar. But there will be an opportunity for questions from attendees near the end of the experts roundtable discussion. And those questions should be submitted in the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom platform screen, not the chat section. The chat section is for you to communicate with each other, where you can post links to matters relevant to the webinar topic and share contact details with each other if you wish to. You're also welcome to scroll through the questions and upvote them. That is, vote for a question that you too would like to be addressed. That will help us to select those questions the panel can answer in the time that we have. I will say apologies in advance if we're not able to answer all questions due to time constraints. Now, in recognition that today's webinar is the last in our series, we'll begin with welcoming comments by SF's director, Irena Zubcevic. Before joining SF in August 2022, Irena worked for over 20 years in the area of sustainable development. First as part of the Croatian Foreign Service from 1993 to 2007, and then at the United Nations Secretariat from 2008 to July 2022, where she contributed to several reports and papers in the area of sustainable development. Irena and her team supported the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development since its inception, where she also supported countries preparing their voluntary national reviews since the beginning of that process in 2016. In her work, Irena has engaged with stakeholders of all kinds, from governments to civil society, business, academia, facilitating their participation in the HLPF and other intergovernmental processes. Irena, hoping you're with us now, you have the floor.
Many thanks, Charles, and thank you for this introduction, and greetings to everybody, wherever you are. We are really privileged to have so many people in our webinars, and many of you have been in touch. And I just wanted to say, because this is our last webinar on the SDGs in this series, as Charles has said, it started in November last year. And we were also doing it in order to timing it in a way that it can that it will finish before the high-level political forum on sustainable development, which will begin in New York at the UN headquarters on the 10th of July. And also these webinars will be contributing to the SDG Summit, which will take place, as you know, in September on the 18th and 19th September. And I just wanted to thank all of our speakers throughout all these webinars, and above all the Stakeholder Forum team who have diligently worked on these webinars and made them possible. As Charles has mentioned, these webinars will be used as a contribution to the SDG Summit, but also what would be important, and we would like to use these webinars also to establish communities of practice so that we can connect all stakeholders working on similar issues and create a platform where all of us and all of you can share good practices, lessons learned, and also advance of which is the ultimate goal, advance the achievement of sustainable development goals. I just wanted to talk just for 2 minutes because we have a very exciting webinar on SDGs 15 and 16 in front of us. And that is that there are a lot of other exciting events that will be taking place from now on, apart from the SDG Summit. As you know, there will be also the Summit of the Future. The preparatory ministerial meeting will take place in September. The summit itself will be a year away. So this is an exciting opportunity also to see how the Summit of the Future can be used for the acceleration and achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have also a very important COP on climate coming, as you know, and we have UNEA next year. So there are a lot of UN Environment Assembly. So there are a lot of opportunities where we could work on together on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. So without further ado, I just wanted to ask you to stay in touch. We are going to have other webinars and other opportunities, and also, as I said, the community of practice and our platform. So I hope that we will continue to stay in touch. Thank you very much for all your support, and a big thanks to the SF team. And over back to you, Charles. Thank you.
Irena, thank you so much for that intro, and certainly thank you for noting how much the team has worked on bringing these 8 webinars together. Now, before we hear from David and our panel of experts, we have some comments to set the scene from Jan Gustaf Strandenes. Jan Gustaf began working with the UN on environment and governance matters in the 1970s. He's been lecturing about the UN for nearly 50 years, worked for NGOs at the United Nations in New York during the Commission on Sustainable Development years, and has carried out multiple assignments for UNEP. Earlier in his career, Jan Gustaf worked as a diplomat for Norway's Foreign Office in Botswana and Uganda, and later on directed a large aid and environment NGO in Norway for 2 decades. He is a longtime member of the Stakeholder Forum Board of Directors and our senior advisor on governance. Jan Gustaf's most recent achievement was as the project manager for Towards Stockholm Plus 50, a joint initiative by Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future and the Norwegian Forum for Development and Environment. Jan Gustaf, you have the floor.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you so much. And as we want to say, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are on this planet, the planet which is the very basis for our lives, all lives, in fact, an existence we are threatening because of our inability through decades to understand the consequences of our actions, and this must stop now. We live because of nature, and without nature nothing exists. Our own actions, knowledge, and capacity for understanding all kinds of issues has led us into a paradoxical existence. On one hand, we have managed to bring our world into humanity's worst crisis since we began our existence as human beings. On the other hand, our capacity to understand, analyze, create, and mobilize actions to solve issues has given us the tools to build a better world, a world with unexpected possibilities and well-being for all. A world where knowledge and hopefully wisdom has also given us tools to solve this existential crisis. The 2030 Agenda with its 17 SDGs is at present the best example of a way out of this existential dichotomy. It describes the problems all species face, it analyzes them in social, economic, and environmental contexts, and it provides ideas and solutions in the same contexts. In 8 monthly webinars, as was said earlier, beginning in November last year, covering the vast thematic expanse of the 17 SDGs, we have undertaken to look into and beyond this dichotomy, providing entrance points for probing into all elements of the SDGs and in creative and solid ways provide a fertile ground for new ways of tackling the problems with the aim of accelerating necessary short-term and long-term solutions. SDG 15 and SDG 16 are on the agenda today, 2 goals that in detail as well as holistically comprise and envelop all the other SDGs and their targets. The abbreviated text for SDG 15 almost misses the substantive elements of this goal with its short reference to life on land. Read the targets of the SDG 15 in detail, all 12 of them, and then add the 14 official indicators, and any reader would quickly understand that this covers in a comprehensive way the natural environment of this planet. SDG 15 has an obvious interlinked nature. The preceding goal, SDG 14, dealt with oceans and freshwater, and together these 2 goals cover the natural habitat of the planet and give a completely new understanding to the 3rd dimension of sustainable development, the environmental dimension. But there's more to SDG 15. Target 1 states, and I quote, in line with obligations under international agreements. Target 6 reaffirms this by stating as internationally agreed. And these are direct references to the vast number of internationally agreed conventions and multilateral environmental agreements. And there are more than 1,000 of these environmental rules of law that should inspire and direct all of us to respect, protect, and preserve nature, from every individual to powerful decision makers. After the 2030 Agenda was agreed to in 2015, SDG 15 would provide an impetus for nature-based initiatives and processes and came to function as an incubator to coordinate and harmonize initiatives regarding nature and the environment. It also brought together in policy terms what scientists with UNEP and UNESCO had been reporting on for decades. Warnings about the impending environmental disasters have grown in numbers and intensity since the turn of the century. Despite repeated warnings about the precarious situation that global nature had been forced into by our actions, nature had for decades been considered to be of service to humanity's growing need and greed. With the 2015 agreement, it seemed we all had understood the urgency behind the warnings. Rectifying what had gone wrong with the environment now needed substantial implementation. With growing environmental knowledge, we also understood that we were facing a growing complexity, which in turn would require increasingly sophisticated environmental indicators to inform our decisions. Since the 1970s, scientists have warned that humans have used more resources than Earth can provide. This is what is known in simple terms as overshoot. There is a complementary element to this, the planet's ability to provide or renew the resources we use from nature every year. And this is referred to as the planet's biocapacity. When humans' ecological footprint exceeds the planet's biocapacity, we have what's called unsustainable resource use. Unsustainable resource use can occur from some time. Because nature has accumulated resources, for example, stored in a forest, and forests and the necessity to safeguard them are referred to in targets 1, 2, and in 15. It is possible for us to harvest nature at a greater rate than it can be replenished for a certain amount of time. But if humanity's ecological footprint exceeds Earth's biocapacity, how long can we keep going without crossing a tipping point? This is one of the many crucial questions that SDG 15 addresses. And we need answers to this, as well as actions that prevents us from continuing an unsustainable use of the planet. Sustainability scientist Bonnie McBain at Newcastle University phrases this like this: continued overshoot, although possible in the short term, means the global community is increasingly exposed to risks of environmental collapse due to the approach of at least two planetary boundaries relating to land use, expansion, and climate change. And all this has been and is corroborated by reports from UNEP, from UNDESA, from IPCC, and from IPBES. We have been for years alerted to the perils of mismanaging the environment and even given tools to change our actions. When the Rio conference in 1992 gave the world the UN Convention on Biodiversity, it was a novelty, but it built on a series of earlier conventions to safeguard the environment. Likewise, the Rio 1992 conference also agreed to a set of principles called the Rio Principles that should function as tools to help us get back on track. Principle 15 of the 1992 conference is the precautionary principle, and it states where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. SDG 15 encapsulated all these efforts, and the upcoming summit on SDGs should accentuate their implementation. And there is more to SDG 15. Not only does it connect to all the other SDGs, it pushes other intergovernmental processes to come together in a unified effort to safeguard nature and the environment. The agreements from COP15 on biosafety last December on the safeguarding the biosphere is proof of this. And Resolution 5, adopted by the 5th session of the UN Environment Assembly last year, is also proof of this. The resolution is named Nature-Based Solutions for Supporting Sustainable Development, and its content and implementation will be adding further strength to SDG 15. But there is even more to SDG 15. Back in 1973, the economist E.F. Schumacher published a book named Small is Beautiful, a study of economics as if people mattered. Since then, nothing but GDP measurements have mattered until discussions about greening the economy began and theories of circular economies emerged. The global breakthrough on challenging traditional economic theories came in earnest with the 2030 Agenda last year when opening the UN conference in Stockholm to commemorate the 50th anniversary of UNEP. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres declared GDP an obsolete and destructive way of measuring development, resulting in ruining the environment. GDP is not a way to measure richness in the present situation of the world, he said. Instead, we must shift to a circular and regenerative economy. We must, he continued, place true value on the environment and go beyond gross domestic product as a measure of human progress and well-being. He spoke about a new set of values, and thus he actually spoke to the heart of the SDG 15, which in Target 9 expresses a new set of values for all development. It states simply that by 2020, integrate ecosystem and biodiversity values into national and local planning, development processes, poverty reduction, and strategies and accounts. With this, SDG 15 reaches all the other SDGs and challenges us to rethink how we measure progress, and at the same time tells us what these are the basic values that have to be at the basis of implementing the 2030 Agenda. There are no good plans, a program of actions without human rights, justice, and a strong, functional institutional framework based on good governance to monitor implementation. SDG 16 is about these issues. Emblazoned with the dove of peace, the abbreviated text of SDG 16 informs us that SDG 16 is about peace, justice, and strong institutions. All three elements have suffered setbacks during the last few years. In a sense, 16 is about the core issues of the UN itself, human rights and building peace. The efforts to outlaw war and build peace precedes the foundation of the UN by nearly 20 years. Known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact or the Paris Pact, it was signed and went into force in 1929 as the first legal attempt to outlaw war. The UN Charter of 1945 is today among the most important documents urging nations to build and strengthen peace. Continuing its diplomatic efforts, the UN General Assembly, through Resolution 293314, defined aggressive war and adopted this principle in December 1974. Unfortunately, it has been largely ignored since then. However, it has recently taken on a new life as a source for discussion of the definition of the individual crime of aggression within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Global peace is in a precarious state since the uncalled for, brutal, and sustained Russian war of aggression against its neighbor, Ukraine. But this conflict is not the only one today. More than 30 wars are waged. 90% of wartime casualties are civilian. Socioeconomic, political, cultural, and environmental conflicts are creating humanitarian emergencies, displacing about 100 million people. Conflicts have repercussions beyond the geographical area in which they're fought. By the end of 2021, conflicts caused acute food insecurity for 140 million people in more than 20 countries. Justice and democracy not to fare better than peace. The global average democracy score, a survey taken by UNESCO, fell to its lowest level since the index began in 2006. And last year, UNESCO's report on the world trends in freedom of expression and media development sounded strongly the alarm on the worrying decline of press freedom around the world. Data and original analysis confirms that 85% of the world's population experienced a decline in press freedom in their country over the past 5 years. Preparing for the 2019 HLPF, the Task Force on Justice, an initiative of the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies, had prepared a substantial report on justice in relation to SDGs. Among the findings were 5.1 billion people, 2/3 of the world's population, lack meaningful access to justice, and 4.5 billion people are excluded from the opportunities that the law provides. While people in all countries are affected, the burden of this injustice is not randomly distributed among people. The justice gap is both a reflection of structural inequalities and a contributor to these inequalities. On the other hand, the multilateral system can also note progress in areas that were unthinkable a few years ago. Last year, the UN General Assembly recognized the right to a clean and sustainable environment as a human right. In 2019, the Human Rights Council agreed to a resolution on human rights and transitional justice. Transitional justice is today a process responding to massive human rights violations through judicial redress and promoting political reforms in a region or a country, including other measures in order to prevent the recurrence of human rights abuse. This resolution emphasizes that transitional justice is pivotal to implementing SDG 16 and key to establish peace and justice. Without institutions, we will not be able to work together as a global community, united in our efforts to create a world of well-being with justice, peace, and a sustained nature. The multilateral system is challenged today, spurned by politicians and ridiculed by so-called experts. And yet, it has been precisely the multilateral, intergovernmental, multi-stakeholder institutional collaboration that has given us so many victories. The successful eradication of smallpox that through countries had killed hundreds of thousands of people required universal cooperation through institutions, through the WHO. The universal ban to use lead in fuel, which has damaged health for thousands, in particular children, is another perhaps a small but significant victory, a result of UNEP's international and collaborative work. We could go on and enumerate series of collaborative results that are positive for humanity and for each individual. Each in themselves may not loom large, but together they matter. And the sum total creates not a perfect world, but a better world. The Stockholm Declaration, agreed to in 1972 when UNEP was founded, has among its principles access to good education and to proper information on environmental issues. Principle 10 of the Rio 1992 principles built on this initiative and has become a backbone for independent, unabridged access to information and participation. Resolution 67-90, which gives mandates to HLPF, has incorporated these principles in its operative paragraphs. Paragraph 15, to be more specific, speaks of access to information, participation, and decision-making. And again, we see this repeated in SDG 16. The targets in SDG 16 have been criticized for being of an instrumental and mechanistic nature. All the same, SDG 16 has brought and continues to bring the debate and discussions on good governance to the forefront of global cooperation. Also, SDG 16 speaks about an element which is often ignored. In addition to strong institutions, there is also a need for institutional governance. It is also only with good institutional governance that civil society can be included, not symbolically, but as a driving, creative, and constructive force in all international collaboration. A complete implementation of SDG 16 will see the end of authoritarian rule, and maybe that's why it is opposed by a growing number of countries today. New issues must be incorporated, and only open, transparent, accountable, and participatory systems will allow for that. The UN system is an example of this. When founded in 1945, neither the environment nor sustainable development were integrated elements of its work. It is today. When the 2030 agenda was negotiated and finally agreed on in 2015, the complexity and challenges of artificial intelligence was not an issue. Today it is. And today AI must be dealt with, or it will challenge our system of justice, democracy in ways we may not like. SDG 16 is constructed in a way that this may be done. When Isaac Newton, the Enlightenment philosopher and mathematician, was given credit to his amazing discoveries back in the 1600s, he said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." The 2030 agenda stands on the shoulders of previous efforts and is the result of more than 75 years of global collaboration, and its accumulated knowledge allows us to see further than ever before. But with this vision comes our understanding that we must act, and act now. We know what to do, we have the knowledge, we have the plans, we have the money and the tools. Let us now act. Based on this, we could send the SDG Summit in September just one simple question: what are we waiting for? Thank you for your attention.
And Gustav, thank you so much for that very heartfelt summary and assessment of where things are. And I would say to those who haven't joined us for all of the 8 webinars, Gustav has been the person to set the scene each time. We know that he puts a lot of effort into it. It's very thorough, also a little bit of fun. So it was nice to hear about Isaac Newton. He always brings a bit of history in because of his background. Now, moving on, I want to welcome my colleague, Dr. David O'Connor, who will introduce our keynote speakers and the panel of experts. Now, David is a longtime friend of Stakeholder Forum. He is the permanent observer at the United Nations of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN. Previously, he held the United Nations team. He led the United Nations team supporting substantially the UN General Assembly's working group, which crafted the Sustainable Development Goals. Before that, David worked for many years at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, Development Center in Paris, addressing the sustainable development challenges of emerging economies. He holds degrees from University College London in the UK and the universities of Wisconsin at Madison and Yale in Connecticut in the United States. David, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Charles. Good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. Thanks to Irena for her remarks and to Jan Gustav for his quite impressive context setting for this discussion today of SDGs 15 and 16. I'm going to introduce in a moment our stellar cast of experts who will inform our discussions. As with the previous webinars, we are particularly interested today in 2 things. What are the connections between the goals under consideration and the other goals in the SDGs? And how can progress on these goals, 15 and 16, advance progress towards sustainable development in all its complexity and promise? And secondly, how can we accelerate progress towards achieving these goals? Accelerate progress because we have been falling behind. We've been set back by the pandemic and by other factors that Jan Gustav has well outlined. And in particular, how can multi-stakeholder coalitions and partnerships contribute to accelerating that progress? So let me turn to SDG 15, our first set of speakers and panelists. Protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation, and halt biodiversity. Nature and biodiversity have borne the brunt of poorly managed and poorly regulated economic growth over the past century and more. Massive destruction and degradation of the natural world have resulted. Now, a quarter of a way into the 21st century, we are, as a species, beginning to acknowledge the detrimental impact our actions have had on the rest of nature and the imperative of changing our patterns of consumption and production to restore degraded nature and protect what remains. The Global Biodiversity Framework agreed last December in Montreal is meant to guide humanity's course correction. And today we will hear from experts on the challenges ahead, the prospects for and the requisites of learning at last to live in harmony with nature while allowing all of humanity to enjoy human dignity and well-being. So with that, let me introduce our first panel. We have a keynote speaker on SDG 15, Dr. Elisa Morguera, who is professor of global environmental law at the University of Strathclyde Law School in Glasgow, UK, and director of the Ocean Hub, a global interdisciplinary research collaboration on human rights and the marine environment. So she will give the keynote, and then we will have two panelists and one intervention from one of our participants. Dr. Emlyn Koster is a geoscientist focused on humanity's cumulative disruption of the Earth system. Following fieldwork in 3 World Heritage Sites and presidency of the Geological Association of Canada, he was at the helm of 4 nature and science museums, including the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology in Alberta, Canada. Peter van der Gaag, excuse me, has worked, among other things, at the IUCN National Committee for the Netherlands, Triodos Bank. He was the CEO of the Global Natural Capital Coalition, head of sustainability and development impact at the Dutch Development Bank, owner of his own retail business, Next Way of Living, and is currently executive director of the Ecosystem Restoration Foundation in the Netherlands. So without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Dr. Morguera.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to join again this series of webinars. I will focus on SDG 15, but I'm really pleased that we happen to be in conversation with another panel on SDG 16, as I see the two as intrinsically linked, and in fact, opportunities for real progress are very much hinging on that synergy between SDG 15 and 16. So just very briefly to say, and I think it was already covered by the opening remarks, in some ways, SDG 15 is not particularly innovative. It did include targets that had already been crafted by the international biodiversity community as the Aichi biodiversity targets that went up to 2020. It, in a way, includes some of the very well-known and long-standing challenges in protecting biodiversity on land, but in fact, across all areas of biomes. And unfortunately, some of these are the areas where we have developed international law tools and cooperation for decades, and yet we're still struggling to really to really reverse the global biodiversity loss trends. Maybe a key point for reflection today is that in the meantime, and has already been mentioned, we have a new set of global biodiversity goals that had been approved at the end of last year. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in a way sets a higher bar and some more ambitious targets in many of the same areas that SDG 15 addresses. But it also brings a lot of novelty, particularly in terms of including considerations of human rights, which I think is the key bridge with SDG 16. Even with those challenges and SDG 15 finding itself in a way in between the Aichi targets and the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, there is a unique added value that it brings, like that idea of having even pre-existing, pre-agreed global goals included in the Sustainable Development Agenda. Basically means that in looking at biodiversity issues, we need to think about not leaving anyone behind. And that, unfortunately, is not always at the forefront of discussions in international biodiversity fora. It is coming up more and more often, but it's not part of the systemic thinking that we need to really make a difference, both for biodiversity and human well-being. And in some ways, I think it is really the IPBES 2019 Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that gives us a clear picture of the science and both where we are at in terms of failing to reverse the global biodiversity loss trends, but also what that means for human well-being and how that undermines progress across 80% of all the other SDG targets. So really giving us that very clear scientific basis about SDG 15 being a precondition also for the realization of almost all other SDGs. Now, has it been mentioned, a critical point here for how much we know about the state of biodiversity and what we're doing wrong in not ensuring conservation and sustainable use. And there's also still critical areas of knowledge that we haven't developed yet. And we don't have full certainty yet on thresholds and tipping points, particularly for the marine environment. And again, we need to think about SDG 15 and 14 as a whole. And I think this is really important because it was read in an interesting policy brief by the International Institute for Environment and Development that was presenting biodiversity as a development issue, which again, I think is not as widely understood as such as it needs to be. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, we know we're in a global biodiversity crisis, but maybe we need to make sure that whenever we discuss global crisis, and that's particularly the case of the global climate change crisis, we do remember and think through the connections and the interlinks between a global climate, biodiversity, and toxics crisis and how each affects the other. And secondarily, but maybe as importantly, we need to really reflect about what kind of action on the SDGs today and what kind of thinking we need for the future sustainable development agenda in terms of transformative change. We believe that incremental change would be an answer, and I think the scientific evidence is now incontrovertible that we need to shift away from that thinking and from more limited demands from our governments and other change makers, and really start thinking about systemic, deeper change that addresses also power imbalances and equity issues as part and parcel of how we better protect nature. And in my mind, as an international lawyer, I do see that one of the most important areas for us to develop our thinking is that of our increased understanding of the interconnections between human rights and biodiversity. That became very clear with the work of the former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, John Knox, who really basically very much spelled out that whenever we speak about biodiversity, we are speaking of human rights. International biodiversity law is a matter of international human rights law. And while we have made already some progress in terms of understanding how indigenous peoples and other communities' human rights are intrinsically linked to healthy ecosystems, we now know that many other, and in fact, each and every one of us depends in one way or other from healthy ecosystems for our health, culture, but also with particular concerns and contributions by women, children, and persons with disabilities. And we also know that in taking measures to address climate change, to address biodiversity loss, to progress also with economic development, we have led not only to negative impacts on biodiversity, but also to negative impacts on human rights. And we need, again, to really move away, recognize those mistakes, and make it a crucial point moving forward to never repeat those mistakes again. And that has to do with public authorities, but it also has to do with the role of business. All of this is now that relationship with human rights and biodiversity that for a very long time was a bit of a taboo, particularly under international biodiversity fora, has now really become explicit at the front of what we're doing. And that engagement with the human right to a healthy environment and a human rights-based approach is now very clear in the global biodiversity framework. I'm sure there's still misgivings and maybe uncertainties among member states, and I think biodiversity experts about how we take that mission forward and what kind of change it means for the activities we've done until now. I just want to say very briefly that in some ways, a lot of rapprochement between biodiversity and human rights had already happened, even if we weren't mentioning human rights under the Convention on Biological Diversity. But over time, and thanks to the contributions of indigenous peoples representatives and local community representatives, we have developed a set of guidelines that have been relied upon by international human rights bodies to really advance that understanding of better nature protection and better and necessary human rights protection. So we have made progress even before we had that explicit engagement with human rights. And I think this is really important to take note of that and build on those important areas of progress. But there are areas where much more progress is needed. And I think particularly in terms of fully understanding how human health, both the physical and mental health, is dependent in so many ways from biodiversity, from the microbial level to the planetary level, across infectious, onset, non-communicable diseases, psychological and cognitive health, our times of recuperation. And again, we have done some progress, both under the Convention on Biological Diversity and the World Health Organization, but I think much more needs to be done to really take both the scientific evidence and the legal thinking around what it means to ensure protection of biodiversity in a way to ensure full protection of our human health. And I think the key challenge here, which is a challenge that somehow not mentioned in SDG 15, but we know is the real issue in effectively protecting and using sustainably biodiversity, is our land-based investments, how we progress with agricultural development, logging, mining, any activity on land that we know has costs in terms of biodiversity. And what we need to think is not anymore looking at this as a dichotomy. Well, we either progress on land-based investments or we protect biodiversity, but we really question who's benefiting from those proposed land-based investments and who would benefit if we instead chose a path that's more around conservation or more sustainable uses. Keeping in mind that this is not a neutral area for decision-making by governments and by private sector, because in fact, international economic law provides unprecedented and unparalleled protection for foreign direct investors in areas of, really all areas of sustainable development. And in some ways that international protection can even tie the hands of governments when they're trying to find a better balance and ensure protection of biodiversity and protection of human rights of their own population. So this is the real conundrum there, and how we need to then think systematically for transformative change needs to tackle those disparities in international environmental law and international human rights law on the one hand, and international economic law on the other. The other 2 points I want to make in terms of thinking ahead, recommendations for the summit, is that realization of SDG 15 and 16 very much depends on science, advancing that understanding of what nature does for our well-being, particularly in those areas where we need more progress. Also engaging much more genuinely and in more equitable ways with indigenous knowledge and local knowledge. These are all areas where we've made some progress under SDG 15, but in fact where a human rights lens, and particularly the lens of the human right to science, can help us to really tackle systemic challenges and those issues of power and inequity that at the moment make even science not fully in service of SDG 15. And so the final, and that has implications for the role of governments as funders of science, international funders of science, and of course the role of researchers and research institutions too. And my final thought is really about then how can we capitalize on the synergies between SDG 15 and 16 to really advance that transformative change for the protection of biodiversity, and our human rights then depend on it. And I think the work that has been done under the Convention on Biological Diversity, how the ecosystem approach has been framed, is really already very much fertile ground for integrating with the human rights-based approach. And there are very specific benefits that can derive from that systematic bringing together of the ecosystem approach and the human rights approach. From a legal perspective, really clarifying the minimum content of state obligation. Not anything the governments do to conserve biodiversity is really enough, either to really realize SDG 15 or to prevent any foreseeable negative impacts on human rights. And we need to really set minimum standards and clarify that those minimum standards already exist if we read international biodiversity law together with international human rights law. And equal international human rights law provide us with procedural guarantees that we need internationally and nationally in terms of legislation and access to remedies when states and the private sector fall short of that minimum protection of nature and human rights. On the other hand, I think that there's a really important point, which I'm sure will be raised also by other speakers today, which is conceptually thinking about SDG 15 and 16 together also help us very much to think about the policy coherence we really need, and is captured as part of the SDG 17 and our global partnerships. And I think what's important here is that it gives us that frame to think through potential issues, making sure we don't leave any inadvertent impact out, we don't leave anyone behind. And we do that early on at a proactive stage, at a planning stage. And to do that, we really realize where there are needs for capacity building for our planners, for our strategic environmental assessments, to really make that difference and address and find places for transformative change, as opposed to really limit themselves to damage control, which is no longer an option. And through that system thinking, I think we will be able to find new allies for the conservation of biodiversity. I'm thinking about the health sector, but also children's experts, women's experts, and many other experts that are working on other SDGs and maybe not yet see SDG 15 as a precious and in fact indispensable ally for their own work too. So I'll leave it at that and hope I haven't transgressed too much with the time allocated.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Okay, you made some very interesting points, important points, but I don't have time to summarize because we need to move on to Dr. Emlyn Koster. I've already introduced. So without further ado, you have the floor, Dr. Koster. I think there's a short video at the beginning.
(14 and 15), life underwater and life on land, with land occupying just 29% of the Earth's surface, and with 95% of the world's 8 billion people living on 10% of the land, SDG 15 is a very significant goal and area for focus. As a geologist, my contribution to this panel is a long view with a wide-angle lens.
Emlyn, you've dropped out, and also we don't see your video. Can you perhaps start your video and begin again?
Well, the video was to be started by your control, I think, Charles and David, at your end.
We did play the video. Do you want it to continue?
Yes, I will continue, please.
Would you like the video to continue?
Could I come in here? What we mean is you have to turn on your own video so we can see you, Dr.
I'm
Koster.
sorry. Okay, yeah. Thank you. All right.
Okay. Thank you. Great.
Great. Should I continue or restart?
Restart, please. Restart.
Okay. All right. So to just step back a moment, the purpose for including NASA's visualization of the dynamic atmosphere is that this forum is to spur a holistic approach to SDG 13. But as importantly, climate action urgently needs to also draw its stakeholders into an integrated grasp of the equally dynamic atmosphere, the biosphere, with SDGs 14 and 15, life underwater and life on land. With land occupying only 29% of the Earth's surface, and with 95% of the world's 8 billion people living on 10% of the land, SDG 15 is clearly very significant. As a geologist, my contribution to this panel is a long view with a wide-angle lens on the outermost envelope of this 4.5 billion-year-old planet. I ask, how does an Earth system lens help to ameliorate the disrupted nature of the natural world? And how has the perspective of geology become more pertinent since the UN formulated its ambitious agenda 7 years ago? To begin, I wish to echo the outlooks of two renowned biologists. Jane Goodall reminded the world in 1965, humans possess an innate tendency to seek connections with nature and other forms of life. And E.O. Wilson envisioned in 2016 that to strive against odds on behalf of all of life would be humanity at its most noble. In 2020, the International Science Council declared, and I quote, "For the first time in a relationship spanning 300,000 years, instead of the planet shaping humans, humans are shaping the planet. This is the Anthropocene, the age of humans." Simon Dolby, a political economist, had already pointed out, and I quote, "The Anthropocene is a key theme in contemporary speculations about the meaning of the present and the possibilities of the future. How the Anthropocene is interpreted and who gets to invoke which framing of the new human age matters greatly for both the planet and for particular parts of humanity." Leading up to COP27, the Science Council's president-elect Motoko Katani from Japan stated, and I quote, "The great challenge is for basic science and society. The great challenge is for science and society to transcend the invisible barriers and to co-create a new vision of the Earth-human system in an integrated manner." Last year, the founding director of the Max Planck Institute of Geoanthropology, Jürgen Wren, clarified, "We can no longer categorically segregate culture from nature, but must face the fact that these spheres are inescapably mingled." As much as a biological perspective is infused into UN thinking, so too should geological perspectives on the Earth's past, present, and future. The science that informs us about natural hazards and natural resources has also become the science that grasps the cumulative impacts of humanity on the rest of life and the diminished quality of natural environments. My recent article with colleagues from the University of Cambridge and University College London for the International Union of Geological Sciences imagined an Anthropocene renaissance as a coordinated matrix with the subsystems of the Earth-human system in which transdisciplinary involvement of the sciences and humanities is spliced with government and NGO contributions. I urge the UN to adopt the Anthropocene and Earth-human system as key contexts in its planning frameworks. Although timeframes spanning just a decade or two are geological nanoseconds, long-view thoughts may reap transformative dividends. My 8 SDG 15 recommendations are in 2 batches. 4, which would strengthen the remainder of the UN's 2030 vision, and 4 others that would contribute to a stronger approach in the aftermath. So firstly, in the short term, 2023 to 2030, we're halfway through. 1, illuminate the historical and current causes of biodiversity loss. While the last other human species was around 40,000 years ago, an estimated 8.7 million species of plants and other animals, including about 6,000 mammals, remain from the ongoing human-caused extinction. 2, highlight the integration of nature and culture by indigenous peoples, as was just emphasized by the previous speaker. The Iroquois Confederacy and the Dakota practices of being good ancestors with a 7-generation mindset involves a one-world interdependent outlook with values embracing both stability and needed changes. 3, as has also been emphasize SDG 13, 14, and 15 linkages. With warming climates destabilizing ecosystems with their viral diseases and raising sea level, IPCC estimates of the 680 million people living on low-lying coasts with more than 1 billion by 2050 impels courageous visions of managed retreat. 4, showcase examples of ecosystem recovery after human damage. That permitted return of natural processes enables the revival of naturally functioning ecosystems is illustrated by selective logging practices in rainforests and rewilding partnerships at 10 sites in Europe. And in the longer term, 2030 to 2050, at least, one, encourage life-wide, life-deep, and lifelong learning. Anthropological psychology shows that explaining cultural mindsets is a better approach to navigating the world, what we're finding, why it matters, and what remains to be learned, than trying to persuade with science says, fill in the blank. Two, promote an encompassing sense of ecological empathy. The compassionate outlook we strive to bring to human relationships has counterparts in perceptions of non-human animals, especially sentient ones, and to conservation-minded strategies for deteriorated environments. Three, leverage the Anthropocene as a Renaissance framework, as I already mentioned, with the invisible evolution and adaptation of life occupying all environments is abruptly interrupted by an often unknowing and uncaring humanity. There is a profound need for progress in nature and culture synergies. And four, in all remedial measures, engage diverse young adults. Greta Thunberg, the earth-passionate 20-year-old spokesperson from Sweden, has said, and I quote, "When you think about the future today, you don't think beyond the year 2050, but then I will, in the best case, not even have lived half of my life. What happens next? In the year 2078, I will celebrate my 75th birthday. If I have children or grandchildren, maybe they will spend the day with me. Maybe they will ask me about you. What we do or don't do right now will affect my entire life and the lives of my children and grandchildren. What we do or don't do right now, my generation can't undo in the future." This millennium began with a caution from the National Wildlife Federation, and I quote, "Even in the United States, scientists are nowhere near reaching the end of a complete count or even a good estimate of species. Though they believe we have found and named the majority of North American mammals, 482, birds, about 900, and flowering plants, about 19,000, when it comes to creatures that are not big or fuzzy, what we don't know is a percentage somewhere in the double digits. This SDG would therefore perform a valuable service by publishing an annually updated biodiversity dashboard for the Earth's life underwater and life on land. This would be a powerful way to engage those in the front line of knowledge." Thank you, David. I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you very much, Emlyn, for that very stimulating presentation. And again, I won't summarize because we need to move on, but thanks again. And we'll have a discussion at the end, hopefully. Let me now turn to someone who will talk about some of the issues you raised with ecosystem restoration, and that is Peter van der Gaag. I don't know if he's going to be live or in a video, but I guess in a video. Okay, Peter.
I am Peter van der Gaag, and I am the Executive Director of the Ecosystem Restoration Foundation in the Netherlands. This foundation is set up to support the global ecosystem restoration movement, which consists of 60 restoration and regenerative agriculture initiatives around the world, and that are actively restoring degrading ecosystems and introducing regenerative agricultural practices. In response to the subject of today's webinar, I have basically only one theme that I want to touch upon, and that is the power of the bottom-up approach.
Charles, are you there? Can we get the sound back? Am I the only one who cannot hear?
David, you certainly should all be able to hear.
We are not able. I see other people were not able. We've lost a good deal of it so far.
Had you heard it at any point?
At the very beginning.
Okay, well, I'll start it over. Let's check it out now.
Thank you, Stakeholder Forum, for this invitation to participate in this panel discussion on SDG 15. I am Pieter van der Graag, and I am the Executive Director of the Ecosystem Restoration Foundation in the Netherlands. This foundation is set up to support the global ecosystem restoration movement, which consists of 60 restoration and regenerative agriculture initiatives around the world, and that are actively restoring degrading ecosystems and introducing regenerative agricultural practices. In response to the subject of today's webinar, I have basically only one theme that I want to touch upon, and that is the power of the bottom-up approach. My first professional experience in sustainability was at a UN, the United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development 5th session in 1997, which was the preparatory meeting for Rio +5, also in 1997, that summer. At that time, I strongly hoped that international policy would be the change maker we need to steer humanity on a path of sustainable development. But it turned out that international agreements are rarely the platform for change. Change rarely happens at the top of a pyramid. Those at the top feel responsible for keeping the pyramid below them stable, and hence they can really only manage the status quo. And if you look at all the great revolutions over time, they really never happened at the level of government or even in big business. As a matter of fact, if you look at today's giants in business, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Apple, and even Disney, they all started in their parents' garage. So what does this have to do with SDG 15? I ask you to look for the innovations in the garages inside the natural system that are likely to grow into the leading pathways for humanity, and figure out how to enable and power that change. World Resource Institute tells us that community-based approaches to nature conservation and restoration are really the only ones that last. And one of the great leaders in the nature conservation movement, Dr. Jane Goodall, will tell you also that in her experience, community-based approaches are the only ones that work. So let's meet some of those garages, so to speak. Let's start with Majid. Meet Majid. He is a hotel owner that suffered from the drop in tourism after recent terrorist attacks on the Red Sea coast in Egypt, and so dried up his income stream. And that was true for everyone living there. He started an organic farm that now uses the latest regenerative techniques to feed himself, but also to feed his restaurant. His example is now followed by 70 small-scale local Bedouin farmers. They are now integrated in the ecosystem restoration movement, and slowly the restoration of the once lush Sinai is taking place. I want you to meet Yani, who is a businesswoman from Manila, and she realized that her homeland was becoming more and more degraded. She's now working to build a lighthouse in the Philippines to show how nature conservation, rewilding, and regenerative techniques can bring economic well-being. And she's working with the local community, teaching them these new techniques. I want you to meet Yasmin in Somalia. She is starting, as a young woman, with training her community in regenerative agricultural practices, and just recently obtained permission to start restoring a 180-hectare dried riverbed area, involving the people in her community in that process. As ERC, we're tying her to expertise that can help her figure out this path alone. Meet Sean in Guatemala, inspiring man who works with local catch villages in Guatemala to stop destructive slash and burn corn agriculture and replace it with agroforestry. The example he set at one community one local catch community with the local people, has now scaled out to another 160 villages, embracing these nature-conserving agroforestry practices. Now, these are some of the garage pioneering initiatives that are becoming quite bright beacons of hope in a rapidly desertifying and degrading landscape, and are inspiring more involvement in the regions where they are by the people that live there. You will find these initiatives on the interface between humans and nature. And you will find the most inspiring initiatives in those areas where the natural system has degraded in such a way that one can only speak of desertification. And by the way, desertification is happening almost everywhere where we are employing the latest high-input industrial agricultural techniques. Those remove all biodiversity from soil and above, and severely damage neighboring natural areas through extreme high nitrogen deposits, pollution of water systems, and water extraction. Each of these initiatives are lighthouses and living labs. By showing the way, they are leading their neighbors into sustainable change on that human-nature interface. We are so used to want to be at immediate large scale that we focus in our policies and financial flows on scaling up existing initiatives. I am telling you that rapid restoration of natural systems and regeneration in agricultural systems is reached through scaling out. Collaborative local networks are making the changes we need on the ground and are going to have an immense impact on global scale. So now, where does the level of government or UN come in? There are many barriers in place to change. The zoning laws, for example, in the Netherlands, make it difficult to introduce regenerative agroforestry practices. Education is still focused on the industrial agricultural scaling up approach. Market systems are fully based on monoculture production and not on polyculture production. Finance is so short-term that the long run-up to restoration and then regenerative production is too long for finance to step in. And donors, stop your fixation on scale. Start donating to networked, scaled-out initiatives. And then help us, who are doing this, make humanity thrive on this planet sustainably in the next decade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for a fascinating presentation with some very superb recommendations at the end to promote scaling out through networks rather than scaling up. Okay, before we move on to the next discussion on SDG 16, I would like to invite Ms. Shirlene Chin from Green Transparency to say a few words on the work that's been happening over the years and has taken on greater poignancy and visibility on ecocide. So if you will, I'll give her the floor to speak. Shirlene, you have the floor. Okay, can you speak so we can see if...
The video isn't on, but I don't suppose that that's the purpose. Anyways, thank you very much. Here we go.
Please, go ahead. Hello? Are you there, Shirlene?
Yes, sorry about that. It just turned on. Give me 1 second. There we go.
Okay.
Hi. Good day, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, wherever you are. I wish to thank Dr. O'Connor for recognizing me. I will just take a few minutes to add to what our distinguished speakers have already covered. This in particular refers to the global movement to make ecocide a crime, an idea that more and more believe whose time has come. My name is Shirlene Chin, and I work as an independent consultant through my firm, Green Transparency. And I work with various NGOs and initiatives to broker strategic partnerships at the governmental level all the way to the grassroots level. My client here includes Stop Ecocide International, who I'm representing today. Now, what is ecocide, you may ask? In general terms, it is severe harm to nature, which is widespread or long-term. A legal definition co-headed by Professor Philip Sands was launched in June 2021, and it has helped galvanize the ecocide campaign ever since. To date, we have more than 24 countries who have signaled their support. Stop Ecocide International's goal is to make ecocide an international crime under the Rome Statute, the governing document of the International Criminal Court. Now, while SDG 15 does not explicitly mention ecocide, it provides a solid framework and targets that align with broader goals of environmental justice and sustainability. Take, for instance, SDG 15's emphasis on the protection of biodiversity. Just a few weeks ago, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia came to another head, resulting in a breach of the Kakhovka Dam. This has been recognized by Stop Ecocide International, as well as Ukrainian President Zelensky, as an ecocide. This is because, in ecological terms, an attack on a dam can have long-term detrimental effects on habitats. Just imagine the sudden release of a large volume of water, destroying downstream habitats, disrupting the balance of the ecosystem, as well as the contamination of water and soil, both crucial for biodiversity and agricultural lifestyles. Now, in concluding, just keep this in mind. The crime of ecocide can set parameters to deter and prevent the worst harms to nature. I would like to implore all other member states of the UN to consider this legislative path, both internationally and nationally. In the meantime, people like you and I can also support the ecocide movement in various ways. Do visit our website, www.stopecocide.earth, or get in touch with me to learn more. Thank you. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Shirlene, for that very useful presentation. And now we're going to move, without further ado, to the next group of speakers. And then I hope we'll still have some time at the end for some discussion, but I we'll see. So we have now the discussion of SDG 16. And thanks to Emlyn for this point about the connections to emphasize between SDGs 15 and 16 and why they should be discussed in one forum. He notes that the rector of the UN Chartered University of Peace in Costa Rica, Francisco Rojas, has noted that without protection of the environment of our common home, there will be no peace. Instability and conflict will increase. Today, the construction of peace requires the protection of the planet. Environmental degradation caused by climate change is at the root of many conflicts and will become even more so in the future. Building peace means recognizing the new conflicts resulting from changes in the environment and recognizing how these are generating large movements of people. So in short, the construction of peace requires the protection of the planet. So without any further ado, I'll now introduce the panelists. We have a keynote speaker, Dr. Louis Muhlmann, who is a governance expert, vice chair of the UN Committee of Experts on Public Administration, and a visiting professor of public governance at the University of Leuven in Belgium, and director at Public Strategy for Sustainable Development, PS4SD. Following Louis, we'll have a panel consisting of Dr. Pooja Balasubramanian, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability in Bonn. Dr. Balasubramanian is a social and feminist economist. She's previously worked on SDG 16 and its impacts on poverty and inequality, but her current research is looking at the role of governance in the financial sector as it impacts social policy and care work. Following her, we'll have David Kode, who is the advocacy and campaign lead of Civicus. Originally from Cameroon, David has fought for human rights for over 15 years. He leads Civicus's Stand as My Witness campaign, calling for the release of imprisoned human rights defenders around the world and urging governments to end the persecution of activists. He's also working to strengthen civil society organizations in African countries so they can support and champion free and fair elections. And finally, we'll have Professor Licia Saner Yu, who is president and co-founder of the Center for Socioeconomic Development, CSEND, a 30-year-old NGO based in Geneva, which has ECOSOC special consultative status. She's an expert in organizational development, institutional learning, and is active in policy debates, strategic analysis, and designing of public administrative reforms. Okay, without further ado, I've said that several times now. I'll stop saying it, and let's turn over to Louis Mulman.
Thank you, David. I cannot put on my video, I think. Maybe it's now possible. No, I can start my video because it is yes, okay, good. Hello, hello everybody, and also David, good to see you again. There's another connection. There are many connections between SDGs 15 and 16, but one of them is that I'm a biologist who got distracted by the human ecosystems in government organizations and started working on that more than on natural ecosystems. I have a very short PowerPoint presentation, which I can share if I have the possibility. Yes, I have, I think, and I will share it now. And it's happening, I think, huh? David?
Yes, Louis, it is. If you could expand it to full screen, if you have that option.
Yeah.
Great.
Could you go to full screen? Yeah.
We see it. That's great. Thank you.
Is it full screen now?
No, no, it's not. Could you try again? Full screen?
Yes.
But Louis, I think that's fine the way it is. Go right ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. Next slide. Immediately. I have 2 context slides and 3 concern slides. Maybe it's the age also. I have more and more concerns. I'm not that old that I have like 10 concerns, but 3 I want to share with you. But this is, of course, the context of today. The poly crisis leading to what is called the VUCA world. Everything is volatile, it's uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and you need responses to that. Not only governments, but also other organizations need responses to that. And that is an issue because governments have become relatively weak in the past decades. I'll come back to that. Another context slide is this is like the governance machinery of the government machinery that needs to deal with all these challenges, where policy and governance are 2 sides of one coin, or with the metaphor of yin and yang, the yin and the yang, where policy is what, the goals, the directions, the targets, the timelines, and governance is how you do it, with what kind of tools, instruments, mechanisms. And that can be done in different ways, hierarchical network, market styles, whatever. And then you have also the 8 dimensions of policy coherence for sustainable development, which is a target of SDG 17, but a very important one because it is a kind of a proxy of most of the important governance challenges. You see in the graph that SDG 16 and 17 are the governance goals, the enabling goals, and the other 15 are the policy goals. And the links between that is very important. Now I get to my concerns. The first is that public administration and governance and public sector workforce quality and digital government, they do need a political, financial, and intellectual boost. Why? Some of you may have read Mariana Mazzucato's recent books of the last years. But she has rightly said, and I worked 40 years in the public sector at several levels, and I know that she is right, that the public sector has been neglected and undermined for decades and has lost much of its responsiveness and expertise. There are no experts in many national governments anymore because consultancies have hollowed out public administration and made governments dependent on them, addicted. And the consultancies, the big consultancies, as is written in this recent book, The Big Con, They also don't have the expertise, but they hire the experts. And that means that governments are not able to answer to the big questions themselves. And that goes very far, because rule of law is a cornerstone of SDG 16. But how can we rely on rule of law if governments cannot even make effective laws anymore? So there you need to boost in-house expertise. One example, one of the most, I'm from the Netherlands originally, one of the most important senior civil servants in the Netherlands was 28 years old when I was his head of unit in the ministry, and I made him project manager of a very complex project, and I hired a consultant to do his normal daily routine work. That is turning things around. Normally that doesn't happen. He benefited from that, and I too, but that is a very practical thing what everybody can do. And on governments who have lost their collective intelligence and the basic expertise, you could, one of the best things I think for quick recovery is relatively quick recovery is through peer learning. Always places where there's good expertise left, and they can learn from each other. So that is an important thing to boost. It's not only on the policy, on the content, but really also on the mechanisms to get it done, as in any case from the government side. The second concern, public administration and governance remains invisible for politicians and the public as long as its quality is not measured with the relevant indicators. And the indicator I mentioned already, policy coherence for sustainable development, there is an official indicator, good example. It is a proxy, I said, for effective governance. It has 8 dimensions, sub-indicators. It has a self-assessment tool made by UNEP, but 3 years after reaching an acceptable level, the tier 2 level of the SDGs indicators, it's not being used. There was one country that scored 100% on policy coherence for sustainable development in the self-scoring, but that was an autocratic government, so they could decide that. They didn't even need to fill in the questions. This self-assessment tool is therefore unreliable, but it can be trusted more if a quality protocol is added. And I developed in a workshop with many countries and OECD and UNEP a concrete proposal that will soon be published. The report is available on demand with me at the moment. It's the final draft. That's a very short report suggesting that this is important and urgent also. Time is running out. At a global review of all the SDG indicators starting next year, this one, several people have said in the UN, this one is about to be abolished. And we cannot have that, because if this is not appearing in the list of the main indicators for the SDGs, politicians will think it's not important. But it is. The last and the third concern, the poly crisis drives out complexity governance. Also something that is gradually happening. Crisis management is short-term, of course. It needs legislative shortcuts, emergency legislation, huge amounts of money. Can also afford to ignore parliaments, to ignore stakeholders, to ignore the best available knowledge. And it is addictive. Even politicians are humans, and they are addictive, and power is addictive. And this is a big risk for the SDGs. And crisis management is, of course, important in our times of a poly crisis, which may turn into a perma crisis. But many crises are also wicked problems at the same time. A crisis, climate change is a crisis and a complex wicked problems. And crisis management needs fast top-down approaches, and complex problems needs slower, reflecting approaches. And that has to be combined with, and that needs new leadership. And I don't know what kind of leadership. It will be a bit more participative, I think. And in this leadership example of the penguins is maybe a bad example, where you can see that the number one is really leading the pack. He's on track, but number two, the deputy, is thinking this is not going into the right direction, and the rest is just following because they are busy with other things. So I said three things. One, we need to boost public administration and governance because that is part of the mix and it should not be neglected. We need to measure progress better on governance issues. And we need to find ways to combine crisis and complexity governance, and that can be done by having foresight teams in government, by having a very active role for supreme audit institutions, by having a cross-party sustainable development committee in the parliament, and by training of civil servants and also of non-government organizations. That was what I wanted to say. I hope it didn't. I made the screen bigger, and that's why I don't see my timer anymore. But I hope I didn't take too much time. Thank you very much. David, you're muted.
Thank you. Excellent presentation, very thought-provoking. One takeaway from that, we need to make haste slowly. And that involves building coalitions, dealing with conflicting interests, and finding a way forward, as has been wont with, for example, efforts to craft a just transition away from fossil fuels in some countries. Okay, let's move on now to Dr. Pooja Balasubramanian. Dr. Subramanian, you have the floor, please.
Yeah, hello everyone. Have a good day. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today. So maybe as I start, let me start with plugging in some of the recent work that we've been doing. So recently we wrote a paper along with a colleague, Anita Breuer, and the UNDP Oslo Governance Center on the relationship of the SDG 16 with SDG 1 and SDG 10. So we looked at aspects of good governance and how that has affected poverty and inequality. To understand this interlinkage, what we did is a systematic literature review, reviewed all studies from 2015 onwards that looked at this relationship. And just to summarize what we found that sadly, most of the relationships showed it was a very weak relation between SDG targets. So SDG 16 targets, basically accountability, transparency, and inclusive participation. We found that these targets had a very weak relationship with reducing poverty. And whatever little relationship that came out was primarily driven by economic growth. On the other hand, we found no relationship between targets of SDG 16 on inequality, on reducing inequality. So I think for me as a researcher, this is a very stark takeaway of the targets under SDG 16, particularly accountability, transparency, and inclusive institutions. And I think one thing that was missed out in this literature is holding accountable institutions at the global level. So for instance, the multilateral organizations, the usual suspect like the World Bank, and also donor countries and rich countries who are actually providing aid to a lot of low-income countries. These institutions in these countries have not really been held accountable or in the research. And this is quite perplexing because what we found in our research is that often judicial accountability seems to serve the rich. And even forms of e-governance and digitization, which are flag bearers of accountability and transparency, if anything, have reinforced existing power structures and excluded the people in the margins even further. So what I was asked to come up, as I think about potential policies, I think I have two two policies that I would like to present here, slightly controversial perhaps. Number one, what we need today, if we need to create just institutions, and if we need to imagine just institutions that are accountable and transparent and inclusive, what we need urgently today is debt justice. We immediately need policies such as debt cancellation, and rich donor countries and the World Bank and other multilateral organizations need to provide fiscal space to governments in low-income countries so that they can invest their money into the well-being of their people. So in healthcare, in education, in the public healthcare systems, and for food security. So without debt justice, I think just accountable institutions are a dream. And the second important measure, I think, is creating a global system of wealth taxation. Through the pandemic, I think the number of, Oxfam released a report recently that the number of millionaires and billionaires have increased the most during the pandemic. And what does this say about redistribution systems at the global level? And wealth taxation actually has been talked about, discussed, but really never implemented. And extreme wealth is a deterrent to just institutions, corrupting not just politics, but also the media. And countries should be able to tax corporate wealth and assets and implement measures that prevent corporations from shifting profits to tax havens and hiding the money, whilst at the same time extracting resources and human labor from the low-income countries. So I think these are, for me, like two key policy measures that have to be implemented as we talk about acting now, acting immediately. We have these measures and they have to be implemented, and inequality has to be given really big importance when we think about global, just, accountable institutions and the SDG 16. Thank you very much. I think I stop here.
Thank you very much, Pooja. Some very provocative, interesting points you've made. We'll come back to those in the question and answer period, but I unfortunately want just to move on now because we have two more speakers still. So let me turn now to David Code of Civicus. David, you have the floor, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. And perhaps I should just mention that I'd like to bring the conversation back to the people, to the human aspect of the SDGs and those who matter most, and those who policies and processes are often made on their behalf. And again, I would like to bring this from the perspective of what we do at Civicus, which is human rights and civic space. Now, when you look at SDG 15 and 16, one of the main connections that exist between them is, if you look at SDG 15 and the whole issue about protecting the environment and territorial ecosystems, I want us to look at one custodian of ecosystems and the nature and an environment. And this custodian would be indigenous rights communities, your women who are closer to sources of livelihood, and your rural and grassroots communities. And sometimes when we have conversations around SDGs, these communities are excluded from these conversations and processes. The second is when you look at SDG 16 and, promoting just and inclusive and peaceful societies. The other custodian for this would be civil society and in all its formations. So the point I'm making is that despite the fact that you have these two custodians, indigenous communities, rural communities that are, looking at the environment, and on the other hand, civil society that will make sure that governments implement policies that are human rights based and they hold governments to account in terms of the excesses that some of the governments tend to have. These two communities or custodians are often not consulted when it comes to inclusive societies, when it comes to conflicts, but also when it comes to issues that have to do with the environment. Our research and our publications and those of many other human rights organizations often point to the fact that when these communities, either civil society or indigenous communities, raise concerns about developmental projects, for example, that are sponsored by maybe multinational corporations, that these projects may have a detrimental effect on the environment and on the ecosystems and the livelihoods of these communities, they are often targeted. In the same vein, when civil society raises concerns about issues that have to do with corruption or that promote inclusive societies or even conflict, they are also targeted. So bringing these two communities at the center, that they are custodians in raising concerns when there are excesses to ensure that we have inclusive societies is very important. as far as this conversation is concerned. The second thing I'd like to raise is the prevalence of what we call disinformation or misinformation, again, when it comes to development, or again, when it comes to conflict. And we saw from the pandemic, to humanitarian crisis, that where civil society or communities or individuals that, raise concerns about corruption, that raise concerns about, developmental projects that are detrimental to the environment. When they raise these concerns, there's always the prevalence of disinformation. Some of these individuals or communities are termed anti-development, and they become, targets either by state and non-state actors. And we need to bring in, tech companies into this conversation, because they have a role to play in either mitigating disinformation or ensuring that the right information is passed across to communities. The third and the final point I'd like to make is this whole conversation we've had about global governance and multilateral institutions, and the fact that some of them still continue to operate based on, the objectives that they set, in the immediate post-World War II era, and where you still have so-called big states that, either pass resolutions that favor them or their allies, or the veto resolutions that are against them or their allies. And the Human Rights Council is a case in point. So we are calling for a reformation or a review of these multilateral institutions that will make sure that there's equal access from rural communities to less formal groups to states, but also that will make sure that every decision that is taken is not really based on the interest of one particular state, and that the issue of conflict should be seen as conflict irrespective of where it is happening. So the conflict in Ukraine should be given the same attention as the conflict in Sudan that is happening at the moment, or the conflict in other parts of the world. And lastly, as we head to the SDG Summit, I think we'd want to submit that it is time to act. And one way to do that is, if you look at the last 5-6 years, or even going back to 2015, when the SDGs were formalized, it's been one, resolution after the other. We have all kinds of policies on how to make the environment safe, all kinds of policies on how to resolve conflict, all kinds of resolutions at the UN in New York, and also the Human Rights Council. I think we should, in going to the SDG Summit in September, really focus on implementing these very important decisions that have been made, or resolutions or policies, and not necessarily create other policies and resolutions. Meanwhile, we've not implemented the many beautiful ones that we already have existing. I'll stop there and look forward to the conversations after, if we have time. Thank you, and back to you, David.
Thank you very much, David. That was extremely interesting. And I think we'll come back to this role of indigenous communities, women, rural communities in as custodians of nature, and the inevitable conflicts between them and interests in extracting resources and profiting from nature, and how to reconcile those. Let me move on to our last speaker, Professor Lucia Sane Yu. You have the floor, please.
Yes, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I'm sorry I'm speaking in a very large auditorium. That's why there might be some echo in my talk. I don't know whether you could already see my presentation. It is on the way. But I would like to, I've been very impressed with all my co-panelists and the talk that they gave. I'm sorry, seems like, okay. And I'd like to address some practical side of the good governance. Because I think Louis already mentioned clearly that, there is a consensus. Without good governance, we're not going to be able to achieve the necessary transformation required by the 2030 agenda. and and also not to mention to accelerate. So let me sort of give some of my thoughts here today, and I'm trying to boil it down to some simple points. First point is that from my point of view and our experiences, governance is not about what you need to do, it's actually monitoring what you actually did. And so that is a process, it's an ongoing, it is not one time, and we also need to have better data to allow us to analyze and to decipher what is actually going on. And that's the task of governance. And broadly, I think governance could also offer some predictability and also ensure responsiveness of our policy, of our government in terms of setting different policies, fitting different contexts and locations. And this is a process that reflects more agile type of societal interactions between vulnerable groups, between between different interest groups, and between different needs at the different location, at the different aggregate level. Inside of the 2030 agenda, the SDG 16 gave us very clear indication what needs to be done. So 16.3 dealing with equal access to justice, 16.5 dealing with reducing corruption and bribery, 16.6 dealing with effective, accountable, and transparent institutions, and target 16.7, it's about responsive and inclusive and representative approach to decision making. These goals and targets are well set. And as some of the speakers also mentioned, without robust, strong, effective institution, we're not going to be able to achieve not only SDG 15, but other goals that require public services and public delivery. So what needs to be done is to actually unpack the black box. How do we actually do this thing about preventing, bribery, or about enhancing voices of the vulnerable or underrepresented group, or trying to to allow better justice, access to justice? Do we know where deviation actually happened? Do we know who is doing that? Which department? At what location? So by having an average view of the of the total system and the government, it is not helpful in terms of improving the current state and transforming the current system. The current system is bogged down by many things, not to mention that principal agent phenomenon is a very important one, which deal with the public administration and the power holders themselves, but also about the frequently seen horse trading, or going into some of our belief systems and assumptions about the system. So we need to actually look to shed transparency on the process of getting things done itself. Of course, we also need to make the accountability system work. That we have to involve the actors, the processes, and the outcome, so that we could actually not so much about punishing or sanction, the unconformers, but rather identify where the vulnerabilities of the system actually exist. I'm taking this from the UNITA's work and build on that and suggesting that in order to strengthen, enhance transparency, accountability, and performance, we actually need to intervene at different levels and involve the system, the different groups, organizations, and network, and individual. That is a massive amount of capacity building, as well as collecting localized data and practices. So what are the common gaps in the scenario or the proposal I'm making? There are 4 different gaps that so far that we have identified. First is digital infrastructure that supports data utilization at different aggregate levels, such as local, regional, national, or even as some of the speakers suggested, we need to look at the accountability at the global level to support responsive policy making and implementation. And the second missing point is that we don't have a data collection framework to allow for standardized data, and interoperable data to allow for a higher aggregate level of analysis. So we need to agree to that, and also to give adequate autonomy and coordination capacity to the lower administrative units. Since they have data, they might also have some resources for specific projects. They should be allowed when giving the authority to define the solutions that they want and even propose new solutions. And the last part, which is my main point, is not, all this transparency and accountability is not just about sort of checking with, who's not doing the job as it should, but rather to promote learning and continuous improvement and innovation. So what is missing, putting those 4 gaps together, I think the solution is that we need to start thinking about a governance quality infrastructure in order to generate and track standardized and structured data at scale and at different aggregate levels, so that we could actually carry out the 3 ideas of a quality system: do the right thing, do things right, and fit for purpose. There are different benefits that that could be getting from this, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to enumerate, but nevertheless, trying to say is that we will be able to support a data or scientific approach to policy making at different levels that could cater to more individualized needs of groups and localities and context. Therefore, SDG and 2030 agenda is primarily about transformation. It's about doing the business unusual rather than continue to repeat business as usual, which we know it is still happening. And through this, the governance quality infrastructure, we should be able to feel more confident and comfortable about there is actual coordination taking place. There are better quality in terms of coherence and alignment with goals and mission, and also be more inclusive in terms of representation and voices, and safeguard individual rights to development. So time is now to create this global governance quality infrastructure framework and pilot, try out, and roll, so that it can be adopted by different actors. So therefore, we're no longer talking about accountability, but rather ensuring process accountability and seeing the pathway and the steps toward SDG transformation. So with that note, I close here. And back to you, David.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucia. So we now have just a little over 5 minutes remaining. And I would like to give a chance to the panelists to respond to some of the questions that have been raised. Maybe you already have provided some answers in writing, but there seem to be a couple of important themes that have emerged from today that maybe the panelists can take 1 minute each to reflect on. One is the question of scale and scope, and these problems that we're talking about are global in scale, massive disruptions that have occurred to ecosystems, to nature, and yet, as Peter noted, the solutions are happening very locally, and therefore there's potentially a disconnect, but we need to find ways to network outward to scale out these solutions on a massive scale, basically, if we are to address these problems. And that comes to the second point, which has to do with human rights and the progress that has been made on linking the human rights agenda to the nature conservation sustainable use agenda with the latest global biodiversity framework. And that raises a major challenge, I think, going forward when we're talking about climate change and the ways in which we are going to try to tackle climate change. Some of those solutions have to do with massive interventions in, if you will, or uses of nature, and the custodians of nature may or may not be fully involved and on board with those solutions. And so we have this potential massive challenge of how do we ensure that as we move to implement nature-based solutions, we involve the communities who are the custodians of nature and not just trample on their rights and their interests, but genuinely benefit their well-being in the process, as well as nature's well-being. So those are two questions. And the third one has to do with the governance aspect, and in particular, some of the issues raised about the accountability of global governance institutions. Are we ever going to get to grips with making them accountable in the way that we have sought to make national governments and other levels of government accountable? And there is a new debate which has opened up, thankfully, about reforming in a major way these institutions. But will it actually pan out? Will it happen? Will it happen at the speed and at the scale that we need to make sure that they can support the transformations towards a sustainable future that are absolutely urgent and for which we cannot afford to wait any longer? So let me start with
well, Dr. David, I'm going to hop in as host for a moment, and just to say one thing before we hear from our guests. We do, of course, in fairness to the audience, we did offer to answer some of their questions now, which would mean we would run a little bit over. So if our panel is able to stay with us an extra 5 or 10 minutes, what I would like to suggest are two things. First of all, if the panelists wouldn't mind taking a quick look at the Q&A, because there's some questions in there that I think are significant for our event. Others are more statements. If a panelist sees something that they feel they would like to have a quick answer to, please raise your hand. And then after that, if we don't go through too many questions, I'd like to let Peter at least have the floor first, because he's able to join us now in terms of answering the questions that you made, David. So he could have a few words before we rotate through the others. So
okay, well, may I suggest that we start with Peter and people look at their questions while Peter is speaking, because we don't want to waste time with people scrolling through a bunch of questions. You could have been doing that all along, so hopefully you have been doing it, some of you. Okay, so please, Peter.
Thank you. Actually, I'd like to respond to one issue that was raised on. I spoke very much about this bottom-up movement and these garages. Also to sort of challenge usually these high-level debates, but the high-level debates are crucial because indeed what most of these local initiatives will run into is indeed what were called the large market forces, and I've seen some points made about that in the chat also. The large market forces do need governance. There needs to be regulation in place, and those are not the ones that will solve all the problems. Here in Europe, we now have corporate responsibility rules about to enter into force. You actually need multi-stakeholder approaches to implement those. Next to this role at ERC, I chair in the Netherlands an international responsible investment agreement from the pension fund sector. That's 1.8 trillion euro coming together with the Ministry of Finance, Social Affairs, Foreign Affairs, 8 large NGOs, the trade unions. And what they're doing is they're looking in this multi-stakeholder approach, how can we find out what's going on at the level of particular corporates that these pension funds are investing in, and how can we, through engagement, change some of these things. But there is also a joint lobby now appearing between Oxfam, Amnesty, World Animal Protection, and pension funds towards the ministries to think about regulation when it comes to responsible behavior. So that's a multi-stakeholder approach that I think is breaking through some barriers. And this morning, which is why I was on the train, and you had to look at this horribly jumpy video. We were in Flanders, where the natural stone sector, again, in a multi-stakeholder approach, is trying to look at how to eradicate child labor and forced labor, which is quite prevalent in the natural stone sector. Those are needed at the same time, whilst I'm learning through the ecosystem restoration communities movement that high-level approaches to ecosystem restoration, high-level approaches to introducing new agricultural practices, which is that human-nature interface, generally have very little knowledge of the local circumstances. And I've seen lots of projects come in with great plans and local communities just staring. When you turn it around and you put the initiative at that local level with all the local knowledge that is there, farmers know much better what's going on in the soil than an expert from a large academic institution, because they've been staring at it for decades. If you can turn that around and see how those experiments on the ground are actually resolving problems, and that includes nature conservation, because there's more and more knowledge emerging about how conserved, strong natural areas contribute to stronger agricultural practices. Locally, that's emerging. If we can sort of pull that together and then merge this bottom-up approach with the top-down approach and really figure out how that interface works, and that is a multi-stakeholder enterprise, we are on our way to the solution. And in the pension fund agreement, I see it happening because World Animal Protection and Oxfam bring in those local voices to talk to this high level of decision makers on, trillion-dollar investment decisions. And they are engaging with the large agricultural enterprises who are sourcing from farms, etc. So this whole process we need to bring together. But I think the link between bottom and top is still extremely weak. We talk about it a lot, but very few people probably in this room have ever been to the soils, this is in Spain, that are behind me, and really spoken to those farmers about what they're trying to do to get out of the real trouble they're in.
Great, thank you, Peter. Excellent points. I'm going to basically randomly go through our list of speakers and call on people to intervene. May I call on Emlyn to be the next one, please, to make some remarks?
Yeah, thank you, David. My appeal is to, as I said in my remarks, that we must, I think, in all dimensions of UN planning for now and into the future, maybe more so in the future because of the perilous state of the SDGs now, is back things into the whole Earth context. I'll just say briefly that, back in 1950, there was a projection that once we had a photograph of the Earth taken from the outside, that new ideas as important in history would be let loose. It took 21 years to get to the moon and look back at the planet. Earth Day happened soon after. We really haven't still traveled the journey of a holistic whole Earth view. And now we're spending immense amounts of money to go back to the moon. So my dream would be, how about if the Secretary General communicated with the head of NASA, which is a very influential agency that looks at the planet as a whole, and urge that vision of 1950, that it not be about technological innovation and international prowess, but much more about a sensible, future-minded, balanced nature and culture look at what we can glean as astronauts keep on doing when they see the Earth from outside our own atmosphere. We need that big picture look. The Earth is too focused on human-centric thinking. We need environment, whole Earth thinking.
Great, thanks so much. That's a very good reminder. And I would like to now turn it over to Pooja, please.
I think I quite made my points, but I just don't want to. I felt like maybe I sounded a bit too pessimistic about the whole situation. I mean, yes, there are solutions, and then there are power structures that prevent these solutions from being implemented. But every time we talk about something that is at these higher levels, their resistance at the higher levels, we probably have examples like Peter gave us of individuals and groups at grassroots levels fighting every day for their right to live. So I think in that sense, it's important then to highlight both. And I guess we were, as a panel, able to do that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Pooja. And now, how about Elisa? Could you come in?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think some great points were raised. Maybe just one around local solutions and global challenges. Something I've discussed recently with colleagues in South Africa is that maybe we need to move away from that idea that we need to upscale. Maybe that's just not possible. And we need to think about how we can support multiple diverse local solutions. And what we can do globally is rather prevent and address those global processes and mechanisms that prevent those local solutions, and that those like global economic processes, limitations to local harmony in nature processes, as well as global recognition of those local solutions is needed. And that's where the kind of human rights and nature conservation comes together also in terms of climate change responses, rather than thinking about globally driven, technology-driven solutions, rather find a framework that supports locally grounded, contextual solutions that come from the people that live and breathe, climate change impacts, nature on nature biodiversity loss impacts on their own lives. So really, the job is that of removing global barriers to local innovation and responses that are very true to context and lived experiences.
Great, thanks very much for that. That's a very interesting perspective. Maybe, Lucia, do you have any further thoughts on that, or anything else for that matter? Please.
Just a very quick thought. I think, I cannot agree more that SDG implementation requires bottom-up involvement and active participation, and actually become the local communities and individuals need to be the key actor of implementing some of this necessary change. Nevertheless, we need to have a global overview in terms of what is happening. After all, we are facing a resource crunch, and some of these implementation do require resource injection, even when we come to awareness raising or about the capacity development and also necessary infrastructure and flow of information. So all this, requires some oversight and transparency in terms of what is happening at what place, and also capture some of these success stories so that the knowledge of that can be spread faster. So I still stick to my proposal to say that it's not a technology-driven solution, but it's technology-enabled approach for a more bottom-up involvement. We have the framework. We don't need to continue to discuss on the top. But rather, how do we translate into actions?
Great, thank you. Okay, we have a few more. It seems that David Koda has dropped off. Unfortunately, I was going to recognize him next. I hope he comes back. But in the meantime, the order for the last three will be Louis, and then Shirlene, if you want to say a few things, and then I want Jan Gustav to have the final word here, and then I think Charles will wrap things up at the very end. So, Louis.
Yes, Jan Gustav should have the last word. I fully agree. A few short comments. There was a good question in the Q&As about failed leadership, and is that only about corruption? No, it's not only about corruption. There is much more. And strong leadership is not always, per definition, good leadership. What we need is effective leadership, including young leadership. I mean, young leaders are more visionary sometimes than old leaders. So that's one. Two, I called for a restoration of public administration and governance quality, the expertise that is missing now through peer learning. In Africa, the African peer review mechanism is doing fantastic work on that, but also Stakeholder Forum could play a role in that, I think. And there are maybe more organizations, but it's really necessary, very important. But I do sense that there is raising attention for this important factor. Three, I have 4 points only. Three, the question was raised by David also about global governance institutions. Should we not reform them? I would say let's spend our energy mostly to this recovery and strengthening of national governments and subnational governments. Then there will be also better thinking about the global organizations. it is necessary to revise that global system, I think, but we cannot wait, and the urgency is very much on the national side, where crises have to be and complexity has to be dealt with. My last point is a bit on the side, maybe, but it is again one of these worries, one of these concerns. I see more and more recently that social science research on SDGs is only using academic literature sources. That is a very popular source. I see Pooja, because that was a question I wanted to ask you, but there's no time for that. It's very popular, certainly, this method. And it is very dangerous, because the thing is, sometimes academic articles are being taken seriously by politicians, by decision makers. And if I saw recent examples on policy coherence for sustainable development, for example, where they excluded all the gray literature, that means that everything the OECD 10 reports published on that was excluded, or a report by NGOs, by Concord, completely ignored and excluded. And I think that's a dangerous development. And if this just stays in the science world, fine, I don't care. But as long as it comes out and you see politicians who are citing this and using the wrong conclusions based on what I call wrong scientific methods. That was what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think you've opened up a debate there, Louis, that we cannot resolve here. But as you undoubtedly know, that is sort of the litmus test for getting something into IPCC reports, that it be in a peer-reviewed journal. I guess there probably are exceptions to that in IPCC reports. The question is, how many exceptions do you make, and for what exactly? So, okay, now Shirlene, and then Jan Gustav.
Thanks, David. Yeah, just quick comments and remarks on what we've discussed so far. Top down, bottom up, accountability for, governance, for instance. I'd like to say that, for example, with the Ecocide campaign and also Vanuatu's initiative, that resolution to bring the issue of human rights and the climate crisis to the International Court of Justice, those are really bottom-up initiatives. These are, this answers the question of like, how do we change consciousness? And it is coming from the bottom up. These are people who are, on the grassroots level, acknowledging the institutions, the law, the processes that are already there, rather than reinventing the wheel. They are taking this opportunity to use these, let's say, sleeping mechanisms and reviving them and using them to change what it is that is going to fix our global problem. As a lawyer, it's also, it's easy to say that if there is no law, there's no crime, right? So nullum crimen sine lege. So by introducing, let's say, a crime of ecocide, you draw a red line as to what is prohibited, what is allowed, yeah, and it sets the bar as to like what we can look forward to the future. And then lastly, I'd like to turn to what came out in the recent months by the Global Futures Forum. So this picks off after the UN Secretary General's Our Common Agenda. Global Futures Forum and the Coalition for the UN We Need came up with a set of recommendations that is actually called the People's Pact for the Future, which will feed into the General Assembly's ministerial meeting for the Summit of the Future this September, and then the year after the actual summit itself. And amongst the recommendations that were given, one looks at also how do we change these governance structures, right? And recommendation, again, references the initiative of Vanuatu, supported by the youths from the South Pacific, law students. These are things that are in the recommendations themselves. And this is, a very big reason for states to not dilly-dally anymore. I mean, yeah, slow haste or whatever it was called. I think that we also need to be very smart with the time that we have. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Shirlene. And before I turn to Jan Gustav, I see someone in the comments said that to corroborate the point Shirlene Chin is making about the Vanuatu initiative, this is by Marianne Leite. There's a similar initiative led by Chile in the Inter-American system. This was based on the ICJ example, which shows the power of influence of actions of coalitions of the willing. Very good point. Thank you, Marianne, and thank you, Shirlene. And now, the pièce de résistance, Jan Gustav.
Well, thank you, David. You're very kind, and you've given me a challenge. In 2014, I was told by a well-positioned diplomat who commented on my enthusiasm for the SDGs, and he said, stop thinking about the SDGs, he said, because it's not where things are going to happen in the future. Well, he was really, really wrong about that statement. And of course, I'm happy about that. We've had this series of 8 webinars, and we have had approximately around 60 presenters and experts, and they have talked about the SDGs in a very comprehensive and expert-like way. We've come up with lots of information, new information, and clearly the 2030 Agenda has inspired to a global set of thinking, a new normative set of thinking, even we might say. We've had around between 800 to 1,000 people registered for these seminars, which is quite amazing. And I looked through a lot of the questions, and there's one recurring theme that I would like to phrase like this. We see the problems, we see the drama, we see the disaster looming. Can you please give us some hope? This is a recurring issue. And when I'm asked by my students to give them some hope, I keep saying that, well, the progress in itself is positive. Back in 1962, Rachel Carson published her book, Silent Spring. At the time, she was one person who wanted to change things in a better way. Today, there are millions of us doing the same. So there is progress in that sense. And one concern I have is about civil society. We are a stakeholder group, stakeholder forum is, and I feel that civil society is symbolically treated as necessary in all these documents we're reading. Take the outcome document from Rio plus 20 back in 2012. The report begins and ends with reference to civil society. So clearly everybody wants us to be active, to be present, and to legitimize the processes. As Peter said, the top-down must meet the bottom-up, or the bottom-up maybe should meet the top-down. I am afraid that this is one of the big challenges that we're going to see, the marginalization of civil society everywhere. We see how institutions are closing ranks behind interests that are not so happy about the critical voice that civil society is. But on the other hand, the fact that we're here, the fact that we are being invited, the fact that we produce is a positive thing. So let me just conclude with what I usually say, because of giving people hope. In progress, there is hope. As a historian, I would say that we've come a very long way in a very short period of time. However, as an environmentalist, we have not come far enough. We need to work. And I think that's the action we need to see. And that's why I said in my introduction, message to the SDG Summit, what are we waiting for? Let's act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan Gustav. And now, Charles, I'll turn it over to you to give us some final remarks.
Thank
Please.
you, David, and thank you to all the panelists for your final comments. It's actually very helpful to, after you've spent time with us, to consider what's been discussed today. And thank you, Jan Gustav, for your final words. And also, I'd say thanks to the panel for answering some of the questions. We've had many questions from the audience. We're not going to have time to answer them all. So I appreciate that the panel have put some written answers in so that our attendees can have some recognition of their questions. And I would like to just take one moment before I wrap up to ask Jan Gustav if you'd consider answering one of the questions that's in the Q&A box. It's the very first one, and I think it's an important one. The question specifically is, are there calls to change the targets and indicators in SDG 15. Now, the reason I ask you to address this, Jan-Gustav, is this is a question that in many ways has come up over the 8 webinars and other venues. People challenge the SDGs because they were produced in 2015, but we're now in 2023. But I know there's an important point about changing any of this. So could you just say one quick few words about that?
It brings, of course, us into another webinar for another few hours. But yes, very shortly, there are, as you said, there have been challenges to the targets. And I think that this is one of the things that we can bring up or stimulate to bring up at the summit. And because the targets should be changing, as they are also, our knowledge is changing. And we know that the indicators are being reviewed. And the unfortunate part of the reviews is that civil society is not really into this review. I think this challenges us to be on the technological expert side. So there are opportunities to be able to input some of the reviews. The SDGs, the 17 SDGs, are not set in stone, but we need them as a guiding tool to implement a better world. So let's strengthen them and improve them the way we can do. With civil society, it is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan-Gustav, very much. And I will now wrap up. As you can see, I'm sharing the screen once again. And what I would like to say in particular is to thank everyone from around the globe for joining us today. And in particular, I would like to thank our esteemed panel. You've come to us from all parts of the world at different time zones, and we appreciate that greatly. And a special thanks to our SF advisors, David Horan, David O'Connor, Jan-Gustav Strandines, and Director Irina Zubcevic for making all of these 8 webinars possible. And in particular for today's panel again, and the keynote speakers for delivering such rich and thoughtful content. Now, as mentioned earlier, the webinar has been recorded, and that recording will be posted as a video and as an audio podcast on the Stakeholder Forum website very soon. In addition, the Stakeholder Forum team will be preparing a summary of this and all the other webinars, and that will be input to the United Nations SDG Summit in September 2023. And in closing, while today's was the last of SF's series in the countdown to the UN SDGs webinars, if you plan to be in New York next month for the 2023 HLPF at the United Nations, please join us along with the Permanent Mission of Belize to the United Nations and the Permanent Mission of the Dominican Republic to the United Nations and Stakeholder Forum for an in-person HLPF side event on the 12th of July, as shown on your screen. We'll certainly send some information around to all of our attendees about that. Until then, until the next time, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and goodbye.
Thanks again to all the speakers, panelists, and the participants. And